The Florida House voted to remove the Rodman Dam, which has separated two local waterways for decades.
Conservation groups argue those local concerns are outweighed by the environmental benefits the dam's removal would bring to all communities along the St. Johns River.
Ever wonder what happens when a river gets its memory back? Beneath the murky surface of a forgotten Florida reservoir, more than 20 freshwater springs have been buried for over half a century, drowned by a dam that was never supposed to last this long and never served the purpose it was built for.
Proponents for removing the dam believe that it would restore the Ocklawaha River, which would pump fresh water into the St. Johns River. It was part of a plan to build a canal that would run from the east coast to the west coast of Florida. That plan was scrapped eventually, but the dam stayed and created the Rodman Reservoir.
The Ocklawaha River once ran wild through north-central Florida, feeding those springs, sheltering manatees, and carrying fish from the Atlantic all the way into the heart of the state. Then one decision changed everything, and the river has been waiting ever since for someone to undo it. The dam that was never meant to stay. The story of the Rodman Dam begins not with conservation or water management, but with one of the most ambitious and ultimately misguided infrastructure projects in American history. The Cross Florida Barge Canal was authorized by Congress in 1942. Conceived as a shipping shortcut that would slice a man-made waterway straight across the Florida peninsula, connecting the Gulf of Mexico at Yankeetown to the Atlantic Ocean near Jacksonville. The idea had been floating around since the 19th century, but mid-20th century federal ambition finally gave it the funding and muscle it needed to become real. Construction on the canal began in earnest in the 1960s, with the Army Corps of Engineers deploying a custom-built machine known as the Crusher Crawler, nicknamed the Green Monster, which flattened thousands of ancient cypress trees to clear the canal route. By 1968, a key piece of the infrastructure was complete. The Rodman Dam, also called the Kirkpatrick Dam, was built as a 7,200-foot structure across the lower Ocklawaha River, creating what became known as Rodman Reservoir, a body of water nearly 10,000 acres in size, stretching 15 miles long and up to 2 miles wide near the dam itself. What the reservoir swallowed was devastating. Over 7,500 acres of forested wetlands vanished beneath the rising water. 16 miles of natural river channel were lost. And most significantly, more than 20 freshwater springs that had fed the Ocklawaha for thousands of years were buried under what would eventually become 20 feet of dark, sediment-clouded water. Springs that local communities had fished, swum in, and depended on for generations simply ceased to exist from the surface. Wildlife migration corridors that linked the St. Johns River to Silver Springs were severed completely. Then, 3 years after the dam was completed, President Richard Nixon halted the entire canal project by executive order in 1971. Environmental opposition had been building since construction began, led significantly by scientist Marjorie Harris Carr, who founded Florida Defenders of the Environment and rallied 162 scientists to the cause. The canal was deemed ruinous for Florida's natural systems, and work stopped. But the dam stayed, the reservoir stayed, and the springs remained buried, despite the fact that the project they were sacrificed for had been abandoned entirely. The Ocklawaha River is the largest tributary of the St. Johns River, which is itself Florida's longest river. Before the dam, the river ran with clarity and speed, its water heavily influenced by the outflow from Silver Springs, which pushes an average of 550 million gallons of crystal clear water per day into the Silver River, which then flows into the Ocklawaha. That natural engine gave the Ocklawaha its character, its temperature, and its biological richness. After the dam, the river above it became a stagnant artificial pool requiring constant human intervention just to remain functional as a fishing reservoir. What made the situation even harder to justify was that the reservoir served no utility purpose whatsoever. It did not supply drinking water to any community. It generated no electricity. It was not part of any functioning transportation network. It existed solely as the remnant of a canceled project, sitting across a river that wanted to run free, preventing it from doing so, and burying a natural world beneath its surface. What the springs looked like and why they matter. To understand why restoring these springs matters so deeply, it helps to know what they once were. Before the dam was built, a University of Florida scientist named Elizabeth Abbott went out onto the Ocklawaha and documented the locations of 20 springs that had begun their slow disappearance beneath the reservoir's rising water during the first drawdown after construction. She described one of those lost springs as a blue crystal pool where fishermen marveled at the quality and quantity of fish, including mullet, catfish, and bass. These were not minor seeps. These were robust living ecosystems with names, histories, and ecological functions that stretched back far longer than any human memory of them. Springs like Blue, Bright Angel, Cedar Landing, Mullet Cove, and Tobacco Patch were among those that disappeared beneath the reservoir. They provided cold, clean, mineral-rich water to the Ocklawaha system at a constant temperature year-round, which is why they were so critical to wildlife. Manatees, those gentle marine mammals that migrate seasonally through Florida's waterways, rely on warm spring water during winter months to survive cold snaps. With the springs gone, manatees lost access to a significant network of natural warm water refuges that had served them for centuries. The ecological impact on fish was equally severe. Before the Rodman Dam was completed in 1968, 8 marine species, including American eel, American shad, hog choker, Atlantic needlefish, striped bass, sailfin molly, white mullet, and striped mullet, were able to migrate up and down the Ocklawaha River all the way to Moss Bluff Dam and Silver Springs. The dam ended all of that. Species that depend on free passage between the Atlantic and inland waters for spawning and feeding were cut off. Fish populations declined across the entire connected system, including in Silver Springs itself, where observers began noticing drops in biodiversity that directly tracked with the dam's continued presence. The reservoir also created serious water quality problems. All those cypress trees that were bulldozed into the floodplain before the reservoir filled began to rot, consuming oxygen from the water as they decayed. In the 1980s, massive fish die-off events were recorded as oxygen levels in the reservoir crashed. The water turned dark and murky, nothing like the clear spring-fed river that had existed before. Maintaining the reservoir required herbicide treatments every few years to control explosive growth of invasive aquatic vegetation, a cycle that itself released pulses of nitrogen and phosphorus downstream into the already stressed St. Johns River. Every few years, when the vegetation problem became unmanageable, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection would conduct a drawdown, lowering water levels from 18 feet to 11 feet above mean sea level by releasing water through the dam's spillway. And during those brief drawdown windows, something remarkable happened. The springs came back. Temporarily, partially, imperfectly, but unmistakably, the buried landscape began to breathe again. Ancient cypress trees that had been standing underwater for decades reappeared, their trunks ghostly and gray, draped in sediment but still structurally intact. Wildlife flooded back to the exposed river channel. Photographers, birders, paddlers, and naturalists traveled from across the country to witness it. That periodic glimpse of what the river once was became one of the most powerful arguments for permanent restoration. People who had never thought much about the dam found themselves confronted with the reality of what was hidden beneath it, a complete world that had been waiting in the dark for over half a century. Decades of fighting and the political maze. The push to remove the Rodman Dam did not begin in recent years. Conservation advocates have been making the case since shortly after construction ended, and the effort has moved through a political maze that reflects how complicated ecological restoration becomes when economics, local identity, and political power intersect. For decades, Putnam County, the rural area where Rodman Reservoir sits, became a stronghold of opposition to dam removal. Local politicians argued that the reservoir was an economic lifeline, drawing bass fishermen, boaters, and recreational users who pumped money into a county that has long struggled economically. The reservoir had become part of the local identity, the place where families went to fish, where children learned to boat, where community events were held. Removing it meant disrupting all of that, and local representatives fought hard to prevent any action that might threaten the reservoir's future. Meanwhile, environmental scientists and conservation organizations built an increasingly compelling case on the other side. The dam flooded over 7,500 acres of forested wetlands, submerged 20 springs and 16 miles of the Ocklawaha River, while also causing significant harm to threatened and endangered species, surrounding wetlands, 12 miles of downstream river, and the St. Johns River system itself. The Army Corps of Engineers classified the dam as a high-hazard potential structure, meaning its failure could cause significant downstream damage and potential loss of life. By the time the dam reached its designed 50-year lifespan, continued operation had become a public safety question on top of an ecological one. In 2025, the Florida legislature took what looked like a decisive step forward. Lawmakers approved more than $6.25 million to begin planning the removal of the Rodman Dam and the restoration of the Ocklawaha River. The Florida Springs Council celebrated the legislative approval, noting that breaching the dam would bring back the 20 lost springs drowned by the reservoir, and that Ocklawaha restoration represented the most cost-effective springs protection project in the state. Supporters pointed to a University of Florida study showing that the economic impact from eco-tourists using the natural portions of the Ocklawaha River was twice that of anglers and boaters at Rodman Reservoir, even before a restoration was complete. Then Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed the funding. The setback pushed the fight into the 2026 legislative session, where lawmakers Senator Jason Brodeur and Representative Wyman Dugan filed the Northeast Florida Rivers, Springs, and Community Investment Act, known as Senate Bill 1066 and House Bill 981. The legislation passed the Florida House on a 107-3 vote, a margin that reflected how dramatically public opinion had shifted on the restoration question. A companion Senate measure passed through committee with similarly broad support, receiving just one dissenting vote across 3 panels. The bill called for breaching the Kirkpatrick Dam by December 31, 2032, restoring natural flow between Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha River, and the St. Johns River. It also included provisions for recreational infrastructure, economic development grants for surrounding communities, and an advisory council with local government representation to guide the transition. Supporters argued this was not simply an environmental project, but a regional revitalization, one that would create a 217-mile Great Florida Riverway stretching from Lake Apopka near Orlando, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean near Jacksonville, running through an outdoor recreation corridor tied to a $30 billion statewide outdoor economy. Despite the overwhelming legislative support, the companion Senate bill was never called for a full vote before the 2026 session ended. With no final action taken, the fate of the Ocklawaha restoration remained unresolved as of mid-2026. Yet the momentum built during this period represented something significant, a broad and bipartisan consensus that had been decades in the making, driven by science, economic analysis, and the testimony of thousands of people who had seen the springs come back during drawdowns and refused to accept that they had to stay buried. What restoration would mean for Florida's future? The case for removing the Rodman Dam and restoring the Ocklawaha River reaches far beyond one waterway or one county. Scientists and environmental advocates describe it as a cascading restoration that would benefit connected ecosystems across an enormous geographic area, touching 12 Florida counties and directly or indirectly restoring more than 50 springs tied into the same hydrological network. Start with Silver Springs. The Ocklawaha River historically received crystal clear, temperate spring water from at least 20 freshwater springs, and Silver Springs itself remains the most iconic artesian spring in the world, pumping water that flows into the Silver River and then into the Ocklawaha. Without fish migration through the full river system, Silver Springs has lost much of its biological diversity. Restoring free passage through the Ocklawaha would reconnect Silver Springs to migratory fish populations it has not seen in over 50 years, triggering ecological recovery that scientists believe would be rapid and measurable. The manatee story is particularly urgent. Florida manatees are listed as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Population estimates as of recent years range from roughly 8,000 to nearly 12,000 individuals, and they face serious ongoing threats from watercraft collisions, habitat loss, and cold weather. During winter months, manatees seek warm water refuges to survive cold snaps, and power plants that once provided artificial warm water are increasingly being decommissioned, leaving manatees with fewer reliable options. Restoring the Ocklawaha's 20 springs would provide vital winter refugia for an estimated 1,000 manatees that currently shelter at impermanent industrial warm water sources. Natural springs maintain a constant temperature year-round, making them far more dependable than facilities that could shut down. For fish populations, restoration would be transformative. Striped bass, American shad, American eels, channel catfish, striped mullet, and Atlantic sturgeon would regain migration corridors that have been blocked since 1968. The recovery of these populations would benefit not only the immediate river system, but also the lower St. Johns River estuary, where submerged aquatic vegetation and fish populations have been declining for years. Periodic drawdowns of Rodman Reservoir have been releasing slugs of nitrogen and phosphorus into the lower St. Johns, disrupting salinity balance and stressing the estuary's commercial shellfish and sport fishing industries. Permanent restoration would end that cycle. During the October 2025 drawdown, when the Florida Department of Environmental Protection lowered reservoir levels from 18 to 11 feet above mean sea level, the rare glimpse of the reawakening river drew visitors from across the country, including international tourists, hikers, paddlers, wildlife photographers, and birders flocking to witness the exposed springs and ghost cypress forest. The drawdown ran through March 2026, and tour operators reported surging interest in the region. Businesses noted that the economic activity generated by temporary ecological tourism outpaced what the reservoir produced during normal operations, validating studies that had been making that argument for years. During the 2025 drawdown, seedlings were already emerging from the rich, dark soil of the exposed riverbed, suggesting that natural river vegetation would recover faster than critics of restoration had predicted. Forest ecologists noted that the underlying soil structure remained intact after decades of submersion, and that native plant communities were capable of recolonizing relatively quickly once water levels dropped. The river, given the chance, showed every sign of wanting to remember what it was. The broader vision articulated by the Great Florida Riverway Trust describes a 217-mile connected water system that would become one of the most significant ecological restoration projects in the southeastern United States. Reconnecting the Ocklawaha with Silver Springs and the St. Johns would create a continuous freshwater corridor for wildlife, a blueway for paddlers and motorboats, and a natural laboratory for ecological recovery that scientists could study for generations. It would link Lake Apopka near Orlando to the Atlantic Ocean near Jacksonville, running through national forests, state parks, and rural communities that would gain both conservation value and economic opportunity. What happened beneath the water of Rodman Reservoir for over 50 years is a story about the cost of decisions made without fully understanding what would be lost. The springs were buried because a canal was being built. The canal was never finished, but the burial continued anyway, long past any justification, sustained by inertia, local politics, and an unwillingness to admit that the original intervention had been a mistake. The drawdowns offered a kind of confession, a moment every few years when the reservoir was forced to lower its guard and the truth of what lay beneath became briefly visible. What a full restoration would offer is not just the return of 20 springs. It is the return of an entire ecological logic. The flow of water, the movement of fish, the shelter of manatees, the clarity of spring water mixing into river water and carrying that clarity downstream through a system that has been waiting for it. Florida has done this kind of restoration before, most notably with the Kissimmee River, which was channelized in the mid-20th century and then painstakingly restored over decades to something approaching its original form. Scientists documented remarkable ecological recovery within years of restoration beginning, with wading bird populations, fish diversity, and plant communities returning in ways that exceeded initial projections. Restored rivers, it turns out, remember more than people expect them to. The Ocklawaha awaits the same chance, carrying that same potential within its bends and its buried springs, holding on to 50 years of ecological memory just below the surface. The science is clear. The public support has shifted dramatically, moving from just 15% in favor of dam removal in 2017 to 77% in a 2022 poll of active voters in Putnam and Marion counties. The legislative will has built to an extraordinary degree. What remains is the final decision, the willingness to let a river be a river again, to trust that the springs beneath the water still hold life, and to accept that undoing a mistake, even 60 years later, is always worth doing. And that is the truth about Florida's hidden springs and the dam that has been standing in their way for 6 decades. If this story made you think differently about what lies beneath the surface of decisions we make about nature, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on the incredible Ocklawaha River and make sure you subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. See you in the very next video.